Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Lever Time, the flagship podcast from The Lever, an independent investigative news outlet. I'm David Sirota, the host, and on today's show, we've got a big guest. I'm going to be speaking with comedian, actor, author, YouTuber, all-around interesting person, Russell Brand. Over the last few years, Russell Brand has become a prominent figure for his brand of anti-establishment, pro-spirituality intellectualism. At the same time, he's been criticized for promoting what some have called right-wing conspiracy theories. I spoke with Russell about our current political divisions. I asked him about the criticism he's faced. We talked about how the establishment benefits from the divisions in our society and what it would take to overcome those divisions. It was really a great, wide-ranging conversation, and I'm really excited for everyone to hear it. This week, our paid subscribers will also get a bonus segment, a really important deep dive interview with Cory Doctorow and Rebecca Giblin about their new book, Choke Point Capitalism: How Big Tech and Big Content Captured Creative Labor Markets and How We'll Win Them Back. The book explores how tech companies tightly control the access to their platforms that allow them to shake down consumers and to shake down artists and creators. If you want access to LeverTime Premium, head over to levernews.com to become a supporting subscriber. That gives you access to all of our premium content, and you'll be directly supporting the investigative journalism that we do here at The Lever. Speaking of which, if you're looking for other ways to support our work, please, please, please share our reporting with your friends and family. Leave this podcast a rating and a review on the podcast player you're listening to it on. The only way that independent media grows is by word of mouth, and we need all the help we can get to combat the inane bullshit that is corporate media. As always, I'm here today with producer Frank. What's up, producer Frank?
Not much, David. Feeling all right today. I've been a little down in the dumps. You might relate to this. I was speaking with my therapist about this past week about how, working in political media, in the news industry, and she laid this out to me beautifully, can often, sort of open our minds to more depressive elements simply because the news is almost always extremely depressing. And I thought that was a really important thing that she pointed out, and it helped me a lot. So I was feeling a little down, but now I'm feeling a little more put together now that I know that there is a reason why I sometimes feel as shitty as I do. Do you ever experience that?
I think feeling shitty is an occupational hazard of journalism in general, and specifically political journalism. I definitely get demoralized at times. Sometimes the waves of demoralization come faster than others. Usually, actually, at around this time of year, I'm somebody who I have a lot of trouble January through March. It feels like, as they say in Groundhog Day.
I'll give you a winter prediction. It's going to be cold, it's going to be gray, and it's going to last you for the rest of your life.
It really does lately feel like it's going to be cold and gray and last the rest of our lives. I mean, maybe I'm saying that just because it's been negative 4 degrees here in Denver and overcast. And the thing about Denver that everyone thinks is that the winters are tough, and the winters can be a little bit tough, but we usually have the sun come out. And I'm somebody, I think I have like seasonal affective disorder or something. I get down when I don't see the sun, and like we haven't seen the sun here in it feels like weeks. It's been kind of out of character. So that plus the political news, I feel you, man. I totally feel you. Now, I will say this as a preview. The discussion with Russell Brand kind of lifted me up in a weird kind of way. It was just so sort of a great stimulating back and forth. I cannot wait.
He's an exuberant person.
He is
how I would describe him.
He is. That's a perfect word for him, an exuberant person. So I can't wait for everybody to hear that interview coming up in a few minutes. But before we get to that story, I want to toggle back to something that is on the depressing, in some ways terrifying side of the reporting that we've done. I want to talk about that story that we are reporting here at The Lever, the ongoing story of that Texas billionaire, Kelcy Warren, the CEO of that natural gas giant called Energy Transfer Partners, which you may, by the way, have seen commercials for during the football games over the weekend. It does a lot of ads about how it's, saving the world and the like. Kelcy Warren, if you've been following our reporting, this is a hugely important story. It's going to seem esoteric, but if you haven't followed our reporting, trust me, this is a huge story with national implications. Kelcy Warren, the CEO of Energy Transfer, is currently suing former Democratic gubernatorial candidate Beto O'Rourke for defamation. Now, you may say, look, I don't care about Beto O'Rourke, or, that race is over. Who cares? It's just one lawsuit. Hear me out here. Kelcy Warren's case alleges that he was defamed when Beto O'Rourke and Beto's campaign criticized Warren for giving a $1 million donation to Texas Governor Greg Abbott. $1 million. A donation made weeks after Abbott signed legislation allowing natural gas companies like Warren's company to opt out of weatherization regulations. This was after that storm blew out the power in Texas. Now, here's why you should care about it. If Warren's case is successful, it could set a national legal precedent for punishing political candidates, or really anyone, who criticize billionaires' political spending. What our new reporting reveals, we did one story on the case, and then we did a follow-up story by Matthew Cunningham Cook. What that new story revealed this week is that if Warren appeals a negative ruling in the lower court, the case could head to the Texas Supreme Court. You may be wondering, why is that a big deal? Well, 3 of the justices on the Texas Supreme Court have received direct campaign contributions from, wait for it, Kelcy Warren, the billionaire bringing the case. Additionally, Kelcy Warren's company has delivered big money to groups that ultimately funneled money to other groups that bankrolled the election bids, or at least boosted the election bids with lots of money, of those Texas Supreme Court judges. So the law is supposed to be blind, the courts are supposed to be blind, impartial, et cetera, et cetera. But here you have a situation where a billionaire is putting a case forward that could create a national legal precedent, and knowing that the case could move to a court where he has donated to 3 of the justices on the court, where his company has pumped money into political groups that ended up boosting the election bids of judges on that court. I mean, seems to me that, and producer Frank, tell me if you think I'm wrong, seems to me that justice really can't be blind. It can't be impartial in a court like that.
Yeah, I think that's something that people, and myself included, forget, is that, not only are the ultra wealthy and corporations able to make campaign donations to elected politicians, they're also, in some cases, can make donations to judges who rule on legal outcomes. And that's absolutely insane. That's completely fucked. And this is one of those stories where you read it, it's important, but you're also like, God damn, it's a really broken system. And I really hope that someone finds a way to fix it soon.
Here's the precedent, right? Is that what could come out of this is that the Supreme Court has ruled that money is speech. That's allowed. Any amount of money is speech. But speaking about money, criticizing, critical speech about money could be punishable.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
That's the crazy precedent that could come out of here. And folks may be listening to this and thinking, well, I'm not in Texas. Why do I care? Well, here's the thing. If Kelcy Warren secures a legal precedent to do this, it says to every other billionaire that they now have an avenue to try to do the same thing. And if it gets to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court rules on this, it could further enshrine that precedent. And I want to go one level deeper here. What's really at issue here, which is incredible to think about, is this thing in libel law. There's a distinction between a public person and a private person. And the broad strokes here are this. A private person, it's easier to prove defamation and libel if a private person says, I've been defamed, than it is for a public person. The idea is that if you're in the arena, if you're engaging in politics, you are a public person inherently, then the threshold by which you can prove you're defamed it's much harder to prove under the law. So what Kelsey Warren is trying to say is that as the CEO of one of the largest pipeline companies in the world, and as a guy who makes made $1 million campaign donation, he wants the court to say he's still not a public person. And therefore, the threshold for proving defamation would be much lower if he secures that precedent. That's a precedent that every billionaire wants. Hey, I'm throwing my money around. I'm a CEO of a giant company, and I want it to be actually easier for me, a billionaire, to shut down speech and get courts to punish people criticizing my spending in the political arena. That's the precedent that could come out of this. A precedent not just in Texas, a precedent in the entire country. And I just want you to imagine, whether you're a conservative or a liberal or whatever you are, do you want to have to fear that if you criticize a billionaire spending in politics, you could get sued into the ground and bankrupted? Do you want courts to say that? And I know there are some conservatives who are like, yeah, I'm glad that Beto's getting punished because they don't like Beto. It's not about Beto. They're not going to like it when some Democratic billionaire is using the same precedent to sue a conservative. This is one of the biggest free speech cases in the country right now. Now, speaking of free speech, that is a good segue to what comes next. We're going to take a quick break, but we're going to be right back with my big interview with somebody who talks a lot about the debate over free speech, the guy, Russell Brand. Welcome back to Lever Time. For our big interview today, I'm going to be speaking with comedian, actor, author, and YouTuber Russell Brand. Most of you were probably introduced to Russell Brand from his film work in comedies like Forgetting Sarah Marshall and Get Him to the Greek. Since then, Russell's work has spanned various mediums. He's written multiple books, articles, hosted podcasts, TV shows, and in the last few years, he's developed a huge online following where his brand of anti-establishment, pro-spirituality intellectualism has garnered him over 6 million subscribers on YouTube. He's also had a fair amount of critics. Some have said his YouTube videos during the peak of the COVID pandemic verged into the vaccine skepticism or even the anti-vax space. Some have flat out accused him of parroting conspiracy theories. We go over all of that in our discussion. Now, regardless of what you think, to my mind, it's clear that Russell has a unique ability to present populist ideas and policies in a really compelling way to a huge audience. So we talked about all of these different issues. He took some tough questions. We went back and forth. I talked to him about his ideological objectives. What is he really in this to do? I talked to him about the criticisms that have been levied against him. And I talked to him about why the establishment purposely sows political division to maintain its power. Hey, Russell, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm really well, David. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. So before we get into all the issues of the day, I wanted to start just a little bit with you. You've led a really eventful life with a career that spanned all sorts of mediums. I think most people were probably introduced to you as an actor and a comedian in the early 2000s in movies like Forgetting Sarah Marshall. And since then, you've written books, articles, hosted podcasts, TV shows, and evolved into what some describe as kind of a thought leader, free thinker with an online following of over 6 million people. So let's start there. What would you say your primary goal is with the work that you're doing now?
Our primary goal now, David, is to help people to recognize that the old taxonomies of left and right, as we once understood them, are atrophying to a point of redundancy, that there is a requirement for a new political discourse that includes an understanding of personal spirituality, but we are further advanced down the pathway to materialism, individualism, and a kind of unconscious tyranny than perhaps we realize. That there is an obligation to question centralized media narratives and establishment ideals and interrogate them wherever we find them. So in a sense, it's to approach with humility complex subjects, recognizing that no one has a monopoly on truth, although there are a lot of monopolies out there that want them, and to encourage new forms of alliance, whether that's from people from previously divergent backgrounds and beliefs and ideals, or previously disparate ideas such as spirituality and politics, to kind of bring about a new populist reckoning, so that the establishment power has to be held account to some genuinely new, rigorous voices.
Well, I would ask you then as a follow-up, how do you think we got to this place where everything is ramrodded into so-called right and left, how the old ideologies, as you call them, have atrophied to the point of redundancy? When did that happen? What is responsible for that happening? And did it accelerate in the last few years, recently?
I think it did accelerate in the last few years. And of course, there are so many ways that story could be told. But the only version of it that I'm qualified to speculate on, David, is the kind of conflation between liberal ideals and traditional economic, financial, and corporate interests that probably began to accelerate around the administrations of Tony Blair in our country and Bill Clinton in yours, a kind of repackaged neoliberalism that showcases ethical and moral issues while ultimately supporting the same kind of financial interests that conventionally would have been regarded as corporate right wing.
Let me ask about where we are today. I mean, it seems to me that there is a lot of questioning of establishment power out there, that there's clearly an appetite for people to not really believe what the establishment, as it were, is selling. But there's also this fear, and I think it's a legit fear, that being skeptical of what the establishment is saying, rightly so, can lead into being skeptical of anything that is a verifiable fact. I mean, this is the whole debate over misinformation and so-called disinformation and the like. I feel like if we're aiming to get at the truth in a lot of these debates, whether it's about the pandemic, whether it's about vaccines, whether it's about how the economy should work or how it shouldn't work, I don't know where the middle ground is between not simply accepting what the establishment says, but then inadvertently tipping over into not accepting verifiable truths. I mean, how do you think about that push and pull?
I feel that the obligation ultimately lies with the powerful. And what I mean by that is the sets of elite establishment interests that broadly coalesce around control of media, financial interests, and the state. I feel that many of the arguments that are being advanced around misinformation and disinformation are an attempt to censor narratives that are adversarial to preferred centralized agenda-led narratives. I think that much of the discourse around conspiracy theories, though a lot, of course, not all of it, is an attempt to shut down dissent and smear dissenting voices. I think there's an overt attempt to conflate the more hysterical and baroque aspects of counter-establishment narratives with the more reasonable and inquiring arguments. And I suppose where do people draw the line? I don't really No, David. For me personally, my tendency is somewhat anti-establishment, and it always was. And that meant that, a few years ago when I wrote that book, Revolution, I was kind of regarded as a febrile lefty and almost a communist. And, and as every Latin or Central American person in LA would attest, did we cross the line or did the line cross us? At some point, these views started being anti-establishmentism started being associated with a totally different set of beliefs. And a friend of mine, Adam Curtis, the brilliant documentary maker, when I sort of advanced what my concerns were about the kind of spaces where many of the things I believed in were being discussed and the kind of associations that some of those ideas might have had that I might not have been conventionally comfortable with, given that I come from a sort of background that's, you might call ultimately blue collar background, sort of socioeconomically, and then ultimately a person working in media and the kind of sort of liberalism that typically one associates with that. He said, Curtis, that the anti-establishment movements are clearly coming from a different place now, but they needn't necessarily maintain the kind of connections that they have with aspects of those ideologies that people like perhaps yourself and myself may not be comfortable with. There's clearly a space, I believe, David, for libertarianism, anarcho-syndicalism, discussion around freedom, and ultimately bloody democracy to be discussed without it being tainted with some of the more lurid strands of countercultural discourse.
I mean, let's take an issue like climate change for a sec. Okay, so this is the thing that I don't have a great answer for, which is this. You've got 99.9% of science from all over the world saying, yes, climate change is happening. And I'm only using climate change as an example. Yes, climate change is happening. Yes, humans have contributed to it, prompted it, et cetera, et cetera. There's a small number of science that says, no, this is just natural. There's certainly a variation in science and how severe the crisis will be. It's hard to predict the future. I think basically most official establishment sources would say, yes, climate change is real. Yes, it is human caused. But there has been, at least certainly up until now, an effort to take that small 0.01% of science, the uncertainty of future projections, and say, aha, climate change isn't actually a big deal. It may not be human caused. And both kinds of things can be true at the same time. Yes, we don't know exactly how intense it's going to be. But yes, we can say with certainty that it is happening. And I think the fear from folks who don't want to see climate denialism affect policy is that you've got sort of opportunistic folks out there, whether it's with the oil and gas industry or anyone else, that wants to take the small amount of uncertainty and blow it up into a justification for denial. And so then you have an impulse from folks who feel like they're standing with the science to try to suppress or shadow ban that kind of speech. Now, I'm not for suppressing free speech, but I think there's like this concern that the public isn't mature enough, isn't adult enough, if you will, to sort of to listen to both sides of the argument and get closer to the truth. And I can admit, I'm not sure the public is. I'm not sure we're living in a media or ecosystem or society where we can deal with nuance. What do you think about all that? Like, how do we deal with the fact that science can tell us something, and then that there's some science that will contradict that, and that this society has trouble processing any kind of nuance?
David, I think the problem that you're circling is one of enormous distrust, and I would say legitimate distrust of the establishment. Whatever the issue, whether it's the pandemic, the current conflict in Ukraine, climate change, take any one of a number of the issues that tend to determine the cycle of most news outlets. When it comes to policy, what interests me is, are the policies that are being proposed advantageous to a set of establishment elite interests or not? whenever these issues are discussed at the WEF, as we've spoken about on my show, it seems that it's always about presenting solutions that mean that establishment interests don't have to alter their trajectory. No one at the WEF ever is discussing ideas about how there's going to be less opportunity for profit for big pharma, less opportunity for profit and power for big tech, and less ability to regulate by the state. And I also feel that whether it's, I felt this became exemplified critically during the opioid crisis. For a long time, there's been the framing around mental illness and addiction that it's somehow a problem that individuals have. Swathes of individuals appear to be becoming chronically depressed and suicidal all across America. I wonder if there is some corollary or something about the framing that we could, and like whenever it comes to blame, it's the fault of the individual. Whenever it comes to profit, it's the opportunity for the establishment. So, in a way, the issues, of course, if you're dealing with centralized populations in like sovereign states and nations, you're going to have to be able to house a wide spectrum of opinions, and that's going to involve conflict. And democracy means, I think, that you have to afford, allow, and encourage that conflict. What I would say it ought to be the determining barometer for where the truth is in this stuff, David, is are the solutions being proposed ultimately going to penalize ordinary people? Are they like, oh, we're going to have to do this tax where ordinary people are going to get taxed? We're going to have to introduce these measures where ordinary people are not going to be allowed to travel? Or is it going to be, right, where we're going to start is we're ending lobbying. We're ending profits for these corporations. We're demonopolizing these institutions. We're renationalizing these municipal facilities, collectivizing them, making them democratic. We're going to ensure that workers for big tech companies have the right to unionize, are encouraged to unionize, and have correct conditions. Until you have a political movement that starts to demonstrate a real and meaningful interest in the lives of ordinary Americans, people in Britain, starts to encourage a new kind of unity and togetherness instead of constantly stoking division around each of the issues coincidentally that we've listed, encouraging conflagration, encouraging doubt, highlighting conspiracy or biases or prejudices at the extremes, and dismissiveness, piety and pomposity at the other end of it, then you're not going to have the required consensus to make meaningful change. And the system above all else is self-sustaining. The system above all else will encourage only narratives that prevent people unifying, that prevent us from seeing that, look, we're different. Me and you, if we were trying to run society, there'd be things we disagreed with, but surely we could rely on something somewhat universal, even though the very idea of the universal is being challenged. But the same way that we have an inner architecture that we know is somewhat reliable. You and I have got skeletons, kidneys, hearts, lungs, as well as the many differences that we have. Ultimately, there seems to be some archetypal resource that we can lean into. If you're a person that believes in individual freedom, then you can see what the scope of that might be when it comes to sexuality, identity, religious beliefs, orthodoxy, tradition, progressivism. Then a belief in individual freedom cannot be, I believe in this individual freedom, but not that individual freedom. If you are doubtful about the establishment and their agenda, then ultimately I think you have to have a free conversation, the ability to form new alliances, and I believe that the real answer here is democracy. Wherever possible, we should democratize our communities, democratize our workplaces, and allow people to be wrong and make mistakes without turning it into some sort of into heresy and immolation.
On your point about the WEF, Davos, the World Economic Forum.
Early in what I was saying, David, for the rest of the time were you like, oh God, I just want to make this point about Davos, and God, that English guy's still talking.
Well, the thing I think that's important about Davos is that it is such a symbol. It's really the pure form of every policy, even if it's a policy informed by science. Somehow every policy, just to echo you, has to serve first and foremost the rich, the already rich and the already powerful, has to serve the establishment. And look, I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you in the sense that We lived through a financial crisis based on lies justifying deregulation. We lived through the Iraq War based on lies about what was going on in that region. I mean, the social contract between the government in this country and the people has been shredded over and over and over again. I mean, I did this long podcast series about how if you really want to understand the rise of Donald Trump, you have to look at what happened in the financial crisis. And you don't have to trust me about that. It was Steve Bannon who said the legacy of the financial crisis is Donald Trump. I mean, I think what he's kind of saying there is that if you shred the credibility and the trust between the government and the people in whose name it's governing, you're gonna create a kind of systemic distrust that can go in all sorts of different directions. Now, that is a good segue to the question of how to know or how to decide who to make a common cause with or alliances with. I mean, some have suggested in recent years that you've drifted to the right. I mean, your show is on Rumble, which is the same platform that hosts some conservative folks. Why do you think critics say that? And do you ever worry that righteous opposition to the establishment can slip over into alliance with far-right movements that you don't want to be a part of or that you don't want to be affiliated with or that fuel a kind of anti-democratic movement?
I think we have to focus as best we can on outcomes and inclusivity. I know that things I believe in are the rights of ordinary workers to earn good money, the demonopolization of all corporate power. I believe in freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and I think that you should be free to have a traditional lifestyle if that's what you want, or a progressive lifestyle. And increasingly, I think that these barriers are falling away and melting. When you get Noam Chomsky, David, saying that Trump is one of the only viable anti-war voices, when you get Tucker Carlson as one of the only people that's willing to talk about demonopolization, we have to acknowledge, those of us that have had affiliations with what was once known as the left, that the establishment is now using the aesthetic of liberalism in order to mask its current financial incentives and relationships, and in some cases corruption. Listen, I've got a few things that I want to bring up. One is Bernie Sanders is writing on Fox News about Big Pharma. That was just inconceivable 10 years ago, that a figure to the left, a figure to the left of the center of the Democrat Party is writing on what would have once been regarded as a right-wing, and perhaps you still regard it as, and I don't really care, right-wing mouthpiece. That's where that voice is found now. Look at and the newly elected President Lula of Brazil has just said stuff about Zelensky that if I was to say anywhere than other than Rumble, I'd be a heretic. And I don't really like the feeling of political vagrancy that's been brought around, but I would rather be a vagrant than be housed in corruption. And those appear to be the options now. And frankly, I think that it's part of the smearing of dissenters is what's taking place. I don't think it's like that. I know what I believe in. When we're getting a Christian Smalls on, who's heading up them Amazon unions, the reason I'm getting him on is because I believe that low-paid workers have the right to unionize. I believe in demonopolization of, I think it's disgusting the collusion that's taken place between the state and big tech and social media platforms during the last few years. I think that Julian Assange should be freed. I think that Snowden ought to be exiled. It's extraordinary to me, David, and I think that the only thing that I have recourse to is, I may be wrong, I may be wrong, I may be wrong. From a spiritual perspective, I try to continually recognize that I don't know what I'm talking about, and I just want to be open and stay connected to sort of what I call Sesame Street values, like service, kindness, compassion, open-heartedness, and that there is no advantage in cutting other people out of the debate. I know that my heart is about democracy, that I don't know what's right for you and your community and your family, and I don't even know what's right for myself sometimes. What I want is the ability to assess information openly and not to, sense continually that the thumb is on the scale, that the only information that we're given is information that will lead to advantageous outcomes to establishment elite interests. Of course I have concerns, but I ultimately I ultimately have faith in what I'm doing, and I believe in the necessity of it. I think there is no more important conversation than finding new affiliations and new alliances between people that were once regarded as being in different places on this clearly amorphous scale.
I'm just curious on a personal level. It seems to me that the effort and the power to marginalize dissent is as powerful as ever. I don't necessarily want to say it's more powerful than it has been. I mean, there were obviously brutal efforts to suppress things like the civil rights movement, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me in this technological world we live in, the ability to censor and crush and marginalize dissent is as powerful as ever. On a personal level, when you are out there speaking sort of undebatable truths about, let's use what you just said, worker power, workers being crushed and the like, that's obviously happening. You're out there, you're talking about it, and you are, by virtue of who you are and what you're saying, there is an effort to marginalize you, almost gaslight you to portray you as some sort of kind of crazy person. I mean, how do you kind of deal with that internally? I mean, I find personally on my level, like when that happens with the reporting that we do, I mean, I'll admit to it. So sometimes I get super demoralized. What about you? I mean, how do you process that?
I remember that first and foremost, my beliefs are spiritual rather than political. My political beliefs are a reflection of my spirituality. I believe in God. I come from a background where I've experienced poverty, where I've experienced addiction. I've been through this giddy sort of carousel of fame and accessed this abundance, voluptuousness, and sort of saccharine treats that it offers you. And it's sort of, in its own way, delightful, and it's certainly distracting. But I've never forgotten. You can't forget. It's stitched into you who you are and where you're from. So when I witnessed the condemnation that took place during Brexit and Trump, something didn't sound right to me. Something didn't feel right. The attempt to demonize and marginalize ordinary working people, to find critiques that would justify the silencing of those voices. Now, I'm not politically adept enough to understand whether or not Brexit was the right thing to do, whether a necessary alliance with the EU is economically advantageous to the majority of Britain. But what I do know is that I do not like to hear great swathes of the population condemned, their interests neglected, their beliefs criticized. I feel that essentially what happened is a little while ago, the professional elite establishment decided that they don't like working people and that they're not willing anymore to stand up for their rights. And that if that means demonizing them and finding ways to say that their rights should be neglected, then so be it. So in a way, David, I feel like a necessary component of being an effective voice is facing the ire of the establishment. And I know what I want. I know what my shortcomings are. I know that I can be vain and self-interested, but I also know that I care about people and I'm willing to be of service and I'm willing to change. That I'm not so caught up in being right about this stuff that I'm not willing to be open. I don't think that we should be contributing to the ongoing polarization that's taking place. I think that we have to move towards each other in a somewhat open-hearted way. And in a sense, that's happening culturally anyway because of necessity, because a few years ago, you wouldn't have got Noam Chomsky saying, oh God, Donald Trump's one of the only anti-war voices, or Bernie Sanders writing like on a Fox News website, because these categories can no longer mask what's really happening. Martin Gurry, that CIA analyst, I'm sure you will have spoken to him, he's fantastic, saying that the terms we ought to be using now are centralized authority versus peripheral dissent. And the problems of peripheral dissent is we often come with critiques and without solutions. And maybe the real problem that we're unwilling to face is that at this point in history, centralized authority at the scale that we've previously known it is no longer tenable. That you can't live in nations of 300 million million people or 60 million people, that democracy ought to be as absolute as possible, that power ought to be devolved wherever possible, that we have to accept that to live in a nation or on a planet means having to cohabit with people whose views you do not share, and that you can't continually advance into the absolute red revs in order to disempower those voices or to deny those voices their place in the public conversation.
I mean, look, I just to add on to that, I remember when I worked on Bernie Sanders' campaign, there was this uproar about Bernie Sanders doing a town hall on Fox News. And I remember working on the campaign and saying, but he's running for president of the whole country. He has to try to meet people where they are and talk to them where they are. And I would say that not just about Bernie Sanders, I'd say that about any candidate running for any national office. And it was considered scandalous that he did it, but he did it anyway. And it actually was pretty successful. And to your point, the idea that these labels, these kind of tribal silos that are imposed on the public, oh, there's us and there's them, and that we can't think of all of us in it together. I think, by the way, in a lot of ways, both sides try to create that frame, and that frame is breaking down. And I agree with you. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that those frames are breaking down. Russell Brand, I know you've got time constraints. I just want to remind folks, Russell, of course, if you don't know him, is a comedian, actor, author, and host of Stay Free with Russell Brand, which streams weekdays on Rumble. You can find more of his work on russellbrand.com. Russell, as always, thanks, man. Thanks for being on the show.
Hold on, I've not finished talking yet, David.
Okay, great.
There was a point where Marianne Williamson, former Democrat candidate, came on. Thanks for that, by the way. That was lovely. She came on our show, and she said that she felt that the Democrat Party would rather lose and have Trump than win and have Bernie. And I would like. Do you feel that that's what happened during that electoral cycle?
Oh boy. I'll put it this way. I think there are it's hard to speak for to say the entire party is a monolith. I would say that the folks who run the Democratic Party, I think if you ask them, would we rather lose the election to Donald Trump and have a fundraising juggernaut under a Trump presidency that we could play against, or would we rather have Bernie Sanders as president? Boy, that's a tough call. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who in their heart of hearts, maybe they wouldn't come out and say it, but in their heart of hearts would have rather had Donald Trump, because it's better. We talked about, short-term interest. It's better for them in the short term, even in the medium term, because they understand that Bernie Sanders and whatever he represents a threat. Not only to the sort of broad, large establishment, but he represents a threat to for instance, the political consulting class. He represents the threat to the lobbying class. He represents a threat to the Washington swamp. And again, I want to underscore, it's not just him. It's what he represents. And I think Marianne Williamson isn't necessarily wrong. Now, I will say this. I don't think the people at the top of the Democratic Party will come out and admit that. They won't come out and say that. They will act that way indeed, but they won't actually come out and say that. And that's sort of the subterfuge of Democratic politics writ large, right? The Democratic Party, very good at issuing press releases and saying that it really supports workers while not actually indeed supporting workers. So it's sort of part of this bait and switch. And frankly, I think a lot of people across the country are recognizing that bait and switch. But the ultimate issue here, Russell, on that question is that the Democrats right now are in a position where they can rely on playing off of Republican extremism. I mean, the Republican Party is like a complete, Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey circus at this point. It's a total freak show. And so I think the Democrats, the top of the Democratic Party, in a certain sense, at least for now, is more powerful than it's ever been in controlling its party, because they've got such an extreme Republican Party to play against. And I'm sitting here as a person who's reported on this for a long time and saying, well, if it's just a kind of bait and switch Democratic Party and a sort of extremist Republican Party, where's the place for everybody else, for sort of regular people who don't want to live in an economic dystopia, who don't want to live in a kind of corporatist establishment run country and society? And I think there's a lot of disaffected people. Now, where they go, That's the big question. Do they go to the right? Do they go to the so-called left? It's very difficult to know. And I think that's what this questions of realignment and this mishmash that we're living through really leaves us. I mean, what do you think?
I think we have to create a new political movement. I really do. Tony Blair, when he was in the process of moving the Labour Party, our equivalent of the Democrats, although of course its traditions are, overtly socialist, had one of his many brilliant mantras was tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And I would offer tough on extremism, tough on the causes of extremism. You're not going to have so many people flocking to the periphery of any political movement if they feel they have a home somewhere in the center. I believe we have to create a new political movement that is perhaps international and certainly decentralized, a new kind of confederacy that represents exactly the class of people that you're describing. If you remember the hysteria that surrounded the election of Biden on the left, it was as if some geriatric messiah had risen cadaverously, like Lazarously, from the grave to save us all. And now we have the appointment of Jeff Zientes, or Zients, who's like worth $442 million that he's raised from Big Pharma, from healthcare companies that have had to do out-of-court settlements. How can you offer that at the same time as saying we beat Big Pharma this year and then expect people to sort of argue that liberal democracy is working? I would say that that's the responsibility, exactly as you have argued in your previous podcast, lays with the liberal establishment for neglecting its obligation to serve ordinary Americans in favor of phatic, demonstrative, symbolic, rhetorical politics that ultimately doesn't lead to improving the lives of the people whose lives most need improving, the majority that they're supposed to represent. We know that if we were to ban lobbying, if we were to ban Congress people owning stocks and shares in the companies that they regulate, you would see a complete new configuration. It would change the political class forever. Why are these ideas not being offered to the electorate? We know why, because that would change things. That would change things. I don't want to be reductive, but one of the things that I picked up as a kid was if voting changed anything, they'd ban it. And when I sort of said that publicly in our country, because I come from a class of people where they go, they don't do nothing. What's the point in voting? You're just going to get one of these schmoes. It's not going to make no difference to you. It's not going to change your life. And then, of course, people say, the reformists say, oh, it might be a small gap, but millions of people live and die in that gap. Well, we've seen what that leads to now. It leads to the rise of demagoguery, the understandable rise all over the world, like the opioid crisis. Is it some sort of coincidence, some bizarre serendipity from this largely materialistic, rational, post-Enlightenment country and ideology that the world over these movements are rising up? Nationalism's plainly a response to anti-globalism. It's a sort of one that I don't think is effective and has many, many problems. But until we start providing solutions where people can feel and see that they're dealing with leaders that care about them, that understand them, that put their interests ahead of their own, then you're going to just see brilliant orators that have the same interests ultimately as the people that preceded them and the people that followed them rise to the top. If you turn politics into entertainment, then you're going to get entertaining politicians. And I think we've seen how costly that's been to the soul of our great democracies.
Well, listen, any discussion of the Democratic Party, where it's been, where it is, and where it's going, I mean, we cover that aggressively here. And some people, by the way, just very quickly, some people ask us why we do that. Why do you cover the Democrats almost as much as you cover the Republicans? And the answer is because they're different parties. There's big differences between them, but they play different roles in many, many, many of the same problems. Russell, thanks so much for joining us today.
David, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
That's it for today's show. As a reminder, our paid subscribers who get Lever Time Premium, you get to hear our bonus segment, my interview with journalist Cory Doctorow and law professor Rebecca Giblin about their fantastic new book, Choke Point Capitalism: How Big Tech and Big Content Captured Creative Labor Markets and How We'll Win Them Back.
You're just really tired of reading books that spend 10 chapters going into great detail about how shit everything is. And then there's one final chapter at the end. It's like a little bit of hand-wavy. Oh, well, we don't have time to go into it in any detail, but maybe just a couple of these things and, things will be better. But that's for another time. We, from the get-go, really wanted this to be a solutions-focused book.
Listeners can subscribe to Lever Time Premium by heading over to levernews.com. When you subscribe, you also get access to all of the Lever's website, our weekly newsletters, and our live events. And that's all for the criminally low price of $8 a month or $70 for the year. One last favor, please be sure to like, subscribe, and write a review for Lever Time on your favorite podcast app. And make sure to head over to levernews.com and check out all of the incredible reporting our team has been doing. Until next time, I'm David Sirota. Rock the boat.